Okay.
We'll go ahead and jump in. Oh, you go back to the beginning right here. Hopefully y'all can hear me just fine. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to only focus on 3 tree fruits today, and that's going to be apples, pears, and peaches, which kind of seem to be the most popular ones. Now, there are other fruit trees that we can grow in Tennessee, but these are the ones that we probably get the most questions on because they're most readily available at stores. They're the most readily available online, and they're the easiest to find. So we're going to be looking at tree fruits. Now, the other day we covered small fruits, so be sure to go on our YouTube channel and look up that video, and you can actually see some other videos that Shelly's putting up right now. So we're going to jump right in, and hopefully this will only be about 30 minutes, and if you're a master gardener, this is a good way to get some CEU credits right now since you're stuck inside. All fruit trees that I'm going to be discussing today, the pears, the apples, and the peaches, require full sun, which is 8 hours of direct sun. Now, that's going to help out with disease management. Sometimes when we let water sit on the leaves for a long time, we have issues with diseases later down the road. But the full sun will help prevent some of these diseases, and we always recommend that these fruits that we're going to be discussing today need to be in full sun. Now, I was reading a publication recently from the University of Georgia, and it says if you're going to plant a pear tree in an area that's less than 8 hours of direct sun, don't even begin to plant a pear tree. So that's where we can eliminate some of our problems is putting the right plant in the right spot. The first requirement for the fruits that we're discussing today is full sun. Now, there are other ones that require some shade, but we're not going to be discussing any of those today. They require well-drained soil. Now, how do we determine if our soil is well drained? Wherever you're going to put these fruits, I would dig a hole, fill it with water, and then if that water is still sitting there a day or two later, then that's probably not a good place for anything really, unless it's an aquatic type plant. So if that hole still holds water 2 days later, you shouldn't be planting any of these fruits that we're discussing today. It needs well drained soil. And a lot of the questions that I get is people are like, I've got apple trees. Well, how much do I fertilize them with? I don't know. A soil test will be able to tell you all of these things from the beginning. It'll be able to tell your pH. It'll be able to tell you how much nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all this stuff to add. What's great about Tennessee is, for the most part, a lot of these fruits that we're discussing are pretty forgiving about the soil. They do require some, but a lot of our soils in Tennessee have pretty good amounts of phosphorus and potassium in them. But if you're going to try to add the fertilizer properly, a soil test will be able to tell you. And it even tells you bluntly at what month of year, how much to add, and if your pH is too high or your pH is too low, what to do about those situations. For the most part, these fruits that we're discussing today, the pH needs to be anywhere from 6 to 6.5. Now, most fruits, that's the ideal pH range. The only one that's kind of the obscure outlier in the group is blueberries. They want a pH from like 4.5 to 5.5. Ideally, they want it 4.8 to 5.2. So some soils in Tennessee are just not conducive enough to blueberries. If you've had issues with blueberries in the past, more than likely the culprit was pH to begin with. And our main requirement for these fruit trees is we have to protect the trunk. What that means is don't hit them with a weed eater. Don't hit them with a lawnmower and open up a wound on the side of it. If we take a weed eater and go all the way around it and we girdle that tree, it's going to stress it out, or it could even kill it to begin with. Because the xylem and the phloem, what actually transmits the water and the food, is right below that bark. And if we remove all that bark, we're removing the water functioning capacities of the plant, and we're really going to stress that thing out, or we're going to kill it. So sometimes when I'm seeing fruit trees in the landscape that people are having issues with, if you just go back and look at where the plant goes into the ground, it usually has been killed by the homeowners from weed eater damage. Research on these cultivars. Please find resistant cultivars. Now, I'm going to go into apples in just a second. There's about 6,000, that's shocking, different cultivars of apples available. Now, some of them have been lost over time. Now, some of them have kind of stood the test of time because they're extremely disease resistant. We've got research to back up all of these different trials that are happening all across the U.S. to tell you, now this apple is really good resistant in apple scab, or this pear is really resistant in fire blight. Do your research, because we have some diseases in Tennessee that's just always going to be a problem. But if we start off with a resistant plant to begin with, we're not going to have that issue. And also buy from reputable nurseries. I hear horror stories because if we plant apple trees or pear trees, we're really not going to get fruit to begin with for 3, 4, 5 years, depending on the size of the plant. Of people waiting 3 or 4 years from buying it from an unreputable type source, and then it turned out to be a completely different cultivar. And they're like, I bought this as a red apple, and it turned out to be a Granny Smith. Now, things like that happen. Now, mistakes happen like that, but it's always best to try to start off with a reputable nursery. And I mentioned, for example, fire blight is extremely prevalent in pears, and we have some pear varieties that are resistant to fire blight. Fire blight is very common in Tennessee. And I wanted to mention that resistance does not mean immunity. Y'all saw me swatting. There's a bee trying to come inside my window. Resistance does not mean that the plant is never going to get it. So even though an apple tree may be resistant to cedar apple rust, that does not mean it's not going to get cedar apple rust, but it does mean it will have a resistance to it. It'll be better off than some of the other cultivars that are extremely susceptible to it. And I mentioned this, and that most of you probably didn't know that, but there are around 6,000 cultivars of apples, and there are a lot of neat heirloom type apples that have been around for years. And there's a lot of great books, one written by a guy named Lee Calhoun, going through a lot of the obscure heirloom type apples that are around. We need to research what we're going to do with them. Now, by that, what I mean is, are you going to be eating them fresh? Are you going to be using them for ciders? Are you going to be making juices out of them? Are you going to be using them to eat with? Now, some apples are not really meant to be eaten fresh because they can either be hard as a rock whenever they come off the tree. For example, Arkansas Black. If you pick it right off the tree in October, it's a later apple. And you try to eat it fresh, it could probably chip a tooth. It's that hard. It's a storing apple, so it's the type of apples that people would store and eat all winter long. If you're going to use one for juicing, make sure you find one for juicing. If you're going to use some for cooking or sauces, make sure you find those that's ideal for that. And also look at the mature size of the rootstock. All apples, well, I shouldn't say all, most apples are grafted, which means that they're on a rootstock that could either be a dwarfing type rootstock, semi-dwarfing, or it could be on a standard type rootstock. Like if we leave an apple tree on a standard type rootstock, it can get 30 feet tall. So some of these dwarfing type rootstocks, we need to see if it's going to be a dwarfing type. It may only get 10 or 12 feet tall. So, and I'm going to show you a chart in just a second with just some of the rootstocks that are available to kind of help minimize that. We should be selecting regional adapted cultivars. We need to find those varieties that have been around in the South for a while. Now, I'm probably going to hurt some people's feelings. Everybody loves a Honeycrisp apple. Honeycrisp apple was developed by the University of Minnesota. How do you think a University of Minnesota derived apple does in Tennessee? It does not do well. We need to find those varieties that were developed in the South. It has different chilling requirements. It does not like the heat. Honeycrisp is not really an ideal apple for Tennessee because it's not bred here. Planting apple times. The ideal time is any time from late winter to early spring before they've leafed out. So if you're buying them online, they'll send you a grafted tree, a whip, could be basically one standard type tree. They should not have leafed out by the time you get them in the ground. You can either get them potted or you can get them bare root. Nurseries have those available right now. And right now they're starting to leaf out in the nursery. So if you have not bought your apple trees yet, I would suggest you go ahead and find them right now and go ahead and get them in the ground so that they can get situated to the soil that you already have. Don't bury too deep. Most of the apples that we see in nurseries, I would say 98% of them are grafted. And we need to leave that graft union above the surface of the soil. So you'll see it go up and you may see a little crook. And that's where that rootstock is a dwarfing rootstock. And we'll say, one called Freedom. A Freedom apple is a good cedar apple rust resistant apple. We put Freedom on top of this rootstock that's dwarfing. We need to leave that graft union anywhere from 2 to 4 inches above the soil. And we should not be putting mulch up around that, because mulch can hold water next to the bark and it can actually rot the bark. No fertilizer at the beginning, and only fertilize according to the recommendations of what you've got from your soil test. The soil needs to be, your apple tree needs to be adapted to your soil. It needs to kind of get used to it. If we go through and start applying heavy doses of fertilizer, it can burn the roots and we can do more damage than what we want. Backfill with the existing soil that you have. A lot of the older recommendations said that we would go through and buy compost. We could buy any type of soil amendments and add that back to the hole. Newer research is suggesting that we should not do that to begin with, because what that does is it creates a small container for that apple tree, and it won't actually go out from that container. So we've got all this great adapted soil, and then we have our clay-like soil that we have in Tennessee, and the roots won't actually venture out to the soil that it needs to, so it kind of stays in there. And also sometimes that can create a pot underground and hold water. So just backfill with the existing soil that you have, and it can be anywhere from a really heavy clay to kind of a loam. Depending on where you're at, it could be a sandy loam or something like that. So just put whatever you dug out of the hole back into the hole with the apple tree. I wanted to show this chart real fast, and this is just a small section of the chart. If you are serious about researching apples to put in your yard, I would go to Purdue and look up their apple resistant chart. Just Google Purdue apple resistant. I think it's also on the UT Hort website, uthort.com. So you'll see 3 different letters right there, R, S, and I think the other one is MRVS. So it tells you some of the more common varieties of apples, about if they're resistant, if they're susceptible, if they're moderately resistant. So if we just kind of scroll down, one of the more popular apples that we probably should be growing in Tennessee is called Freedom. If we scroll across, Freedom is very resistant to apple scab. It's very resistant to fire blight. It's resistant to juniper rust, and that includes cedar apple rust, which if you plant an apple in Wilson County, or basically Tennessee, you're going to have cedar apple rust, and is also resistant to powdery mildew. So that's kind of the ones that we need to be focusing on, are the ones that are resistant. But I didn't put the whole chart on here. You can go through and look for the rest of it. The 3 most common cedar apple rust resistant apples are Liberty, Freedom, and Enterprise, and they've been around for a few years. But if we're looking for some that are resistant to cedar apple rust, not completely immune, but resistant, Liberty, Freedom, and Enterprise would be the first 3 apples that I planted in my orchard. To kind of highlight, let me scroll this down right here. I had mentioned there's a bunch of different rootstocks that you can use for apples. Now you'll see some and people will say, I've got these apples, I put them on Bud 9 or G11 or G202, and that means how big they're going to allow that apple tree to get. So if it's a Bud 9, that's probably the dwarfest rootstock, and that means it's only going to get about 35 to 40% of the original height of the tree. So the original height of a tree, if you can think 25 to 30 feet tall, so that'll be anywhere from 8 to 10 feet tall on an apple tree. And if we plant it just from an apple tree seedling, which a lot of apple trees are grafted on just seedlings, they'll get anywhere from 25 to 30 feet tall. But they could get larger, so some varieties are always going to be a little bit more stout and bigger than other ones. Location, they need to be ideally 50 feet within a pollinator. Now, some fruits are self-pollinating, but a pollinator always helps out. We need to find something that's going to pollinate it with. So there are different charts online. Since there's so many different cultivars, find something that blooms at the same time, because we have some apples that are early blooming. We have some that are late blooming. If you're going to plant a bunch of early blooming apples, find some other ones that are also early blooming to go with them. And also, before you plant the tree, stand where it's going to go and look up. If you've got overhead power lines, if you've got trees that's going to shade it out eventually, where's your septic tank in your yard? Where are your field lines? You don't want to create issues down the road that could have been prevented by putting the right plant in the right spot. Now, some of the common issues that we see with apples, now this is not an all-inclusive list because there are a number of issues that affect apples. Cedar apple rust, apple scab, and fire blight. And that's where if you're having issues with these and you've tried some of the other cultivars in the past, I would go to that chart from Purdue and try to find those that are resistant to cedar apple rust, which are the juniper rust, those that are resistant to apple scab, and those that are resistant to fire blight. Now, not every apple is going to be researched, so if you're into trying something new, now I do the same thing. Sometimes I just want to try something, and then sometimes it pays off and sometimes it doesn't pay off. There's a good picture of cedar apple rust I took last year. If you don't know what it looks like, cedar apple rust has a weird relationship with the cedar trees that we have. It lives part of its year on cedar trees and then part of its year on apple trees or some of the other fruiting trees. But this is what it looks like. So it kind of sporulates on the cedar tree, eastern red cedar, and then it goes to the apple trees. That's what it looks like. If you've never seen it, you get these orange spots. It's called rust because it has this orange type hue to it. I wanted to show a quick spray schedule, so I'm going to show you the link at the bottom. We've got some great spray schedules for apple trees, fruit trees, plums, cherries, peaches, and I'm going to show you how to find those in just a second. But if you are having issues, it's best to spray before you have a problem. Now, I know people will say, is it going to kill the bees? If you scroll down to the fourth box in the middle where it says streptomycin, you should not be spraying anything while it's blooming because for the most part, the bees are only going to go to the blooms. If we spray it while the blooms are open, yes, it will harm the bees. But if we spray when it's not in full bloom, you're not going to affect the bees. So to protect the bees, do not apply insecticides during bloom. And hopefully most of you who are gardeners are following that recommendation to begin with. But this is just some of the recommendations if you're having issues with cedar apple rust, which would be cap 10, cap control, cap 10, and if you've got some insects, which apples have some insect problems also. Now, this whole presentation today is just on growing them. We're not going to go into any of the pests or diseases today or pruning because each one of those topics we could probably spend about an hour on. Now, that's it for just some of the basics on growing pears. I'm going to go through, growing apples. I'm going to go through pears and peaches. Now, pears, for the most part, grow similar, and we prune them similar to apples. They do require full sun. So like that University of Georgia publication said earlier, if you're going to plant a pear somewhere where it doesn't have 8 hours of sun, don't even begin to plant a pear right there. Research the varieties you want. And there are some pear rootstocks that are also dwarfing also. And we have a couple of different varieties of pears. We've got an Oriental and we've got a European. Now, depending on what you want, the Oriental pears can sometimes be bigger. They can be less grainy. Sometimes the Europeans can be grainy, but there's so many cultivars, they can all be different flavors. And some of them I hear have flavors that are like cinnamon and things. So some of the more obscure ones will have different flavors and sharpness, and some should only be used for cooking. Pears, and I mentioned earlier with the apples, it pretty much always helps with a pollinator, but some pears can be self-fertile. So if you are researching some of those pears and you only want to plant one, try to find one that most research says is self-fertile. But double check with multiple sources because sometimes some websites trying to sell you something will not always be the correct information that you need for your garden or your yard. Pears grow well in most soils except poorly drained, so check that soil, dig a hole, fill it full of water, and see if it's actually holding water. Now, pears were one of my favorite trees growing up because my grandfather always had pears, And my aunt and uncle lived there where they live right now. Their house was near my grandfather's, and those pears are still around, and he probably planted those between the 50s and the 60s, and they seem to do pretty well. When we're looking at cultivars of pears, some of the European ones that are recommended are Magnus, Air, Seckel, Kiefer, and Moonglow. One that we commonly see for sale at a lot of box stores, nurseries, garden centers is Bartlett, and that's misspelled. It's supposed to be Bartlett. That's not recommended for Tennessee because it has it's susceptible to fire blight, and we have fire blight in Tennessee. So if you see Bartlett pear for sale, it's probably best for you to leave it for somebody else. And I'm not even going to try to say some of these names on the Asian type pears, but they also do well in Tennessee. But Korean Giant, I can say that one. But look up, there are a bunch of Korean Asian type pears out there and they make really large fruit in Tennessee. All right, that's just an overview on pears. On peaches, you can get them bare root containers. How many of you look at the roots on these fruit trees, any of your vegetables that you're buying before you bring it home? Ideally, we need to be looking at this plant from the inside all the way to the out, because sometimes we'll have bugs hanging out on the leaves. We'll have bugs hanging out on the bark. It could be some scale insects. We could have some issues with the roots. Look at the roots on these vegetables, some of these trees and shrubs that we're buying right now. If the roots are black and they're brown and they're squishy, root rot is probably already set in, and you should not buy it to begin with. It does not matter how cheap it is at the box store and it's on sale. It's only 50 cents. We need to start off with a healthy peach, healthy pear, healthy apple for our orchard. We don't need to bring something home because we think we can save it. Now, I'm guilty of this. I'm not trying to point fingers. I do the same thing. If something's 50 cents, I think, maybe I can save it. It looks pretty healthy. Maybe I can. Sometimes it's not worth the risk trying to bring something home when the roots are already black and mushy, and it's going to die anyways. Peach planting anytime from early spring and also late winter to early spring. That's backwards. On peaches, for the most part, they need to be spaced anywhere from 18 to 20 feet. Now, peaches want an open habit like a candelabra. So apples and pears, you kind of want a central leader. On peaches, you want to cut out the top of the tree, and the sun should be able to reach the center of the tree because that will help out with bugs and it'll help out with diseases. 18 to 20 feet on spacing, but also research the rootstocks that you have because some rootstocks will be a little bit smaller than others. Now, looking at peaches, one issue that we seem to always have with peaches is they get frost whenever they're blooming. Now, peaches right now, and this is the third week of March, they are in full bloom. When is the last frost for Tennessee? Roughly April the 15th. Now, 2 years ago, we had a frost on April the 17th. So April the 15th is just a good guideline because we know the weathermen are always correct in their assumptions of the weather. And I've seen people online asking questions, can I go ahead and plant my tomatoes? It's best to wait on some of these things. Even though it's 80 today, it's 80 tomorrow, we need to kind of hold off until after April the 15th to plant some of those things. Peaches will bloom too early because they're not the right type of peaches for Tennessee. We need to select peaches that have chill hours that are over 1,000. So these were 5 that were recommended for Tennessee. And a chill hour is basically hours when the temperature is between 32 and 45. So peaches will not bloom at that temperature. So it kind of holds those buds. But if we have peaches that are lower chill hours, if we get some warmer days in February, they'll pop out and start blooming. So some of the ones that are popular: Contender, Challenger, Carolina Gold, China Pearl, and Nectar. Now, China Pearl is a white peach, and we have some great white peaches that do well. But I would recommend those ones that are 1,000 chill hour peaches. And these were probably the top 5 for Tennessee. Now, we have some charts that are coming out. UT is doing some different research with pears and apples and blueberries and some other fruits. So in the coming years, we'll have some research to back up some of these recommendations. And there are a lot of recommendations we're using from other extension sources, like Purdue has done a lot with apples and things. So give yourself a chance to research some of these. So research, research, research before you bring home some of these obscure varieties of fruits and vegetables. Now, out of all the fruits that we can grow in Tennessee, I'm going to try not to discourage you, but peaches are probably the most challenging because we have issues with peach borer, plum curculio, bacterial spot, fruit moth, brown rotten. Now that's actually a peach tree at a homeowner's house that had some type of a borer that crawled into the bark and it chewed it and just split the bark and killed the tree really fast. Peaches seem to have more, they seem to have their fair share of diseases and bugs, and Tennessee seems to just be a great location for all of these things to grow and overwinter. So you may need to have a good spray plan for these peaches, and also if your peaches have been blooming too early, it may not even be good to fool with trying to spray them sometimes if they're going to bloom early. You may not have the right type of peaches for Tennessee. But if you're growing peaches in Tennessee, it's go ahead and start with a spray plan right now, because once the plant gets it and you try to start spraying, it's not as effective. A lot of the sprays that we use are used as a preventative as opposed to trying to treat it once it gets it. Just kind of highlighting again on, this was the peach spray chart, so you can excuse me, see part of it. And I'll show you how to find this link completely so that you can go on and find it for yourself and print it out. But Cap 10 is a commonly used fungicide for all fruits, but make sure you're following the label. And again, don't spray these things when they're blooming. So you can see the second tab down, bloom. To protect bees, do not apply insecticides during bloom. This was the publication that I keep referring to a lot. And I keep saying we need to have a good spray plan before the plants actually get insects, before the plants start getting these diseases, these bacterial diseases, these fungal type issues. This publication is publication 1622, and it's written by a whole host of specialists from the University of Tennessee. And you can go on there, scroll down, and it'll tell you, here's an apple spray guide, here's a peach spray guide, here's one for grapes. And if you're trying to find this, just go to uthort.com, uthort.com. And then that's the horticulture website for the educational resources for the horticulture side for UT. So you can click on search, just type in fruit at the top, and this should be one of the top ones that'll pop up. You can scroll down and find it, but this is just all the homeowner recommendations for some of the spray guides that are out there from UT. There's that website, if you couldn't fully hear me where it was, it's uthort.com. And right now, if you've got questions, Extension is still working. We're mostly working from home. I would recommend that you contact your extension agent in your county, and that website is utextension.tennessee.edu. Figure out which county you're in, and you can go through and find your extension agent's email, the phone number to the office. You can leave them voicemails, and if you've got questions, it may be best to email them at this time. And sometimes it's easier to explain things through pictures. So if you've got any questions, we're going to go through the chat. So Shelly, that's all I've got for this.
Lucas, do we want to unmute everybody or give them the opportunity?
Yeah, if you want to unmute and stop recording.
Okay, let me stop recording first.